This is Closereads.
A philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. Hey, we're talking today about Epictetus's Discourses, written down by Epictetus's pupil Arrian around 108 AD. We had done on the Partially Examined Life a prior episode on his manual, which is sort of a summary of the Discourses, but we wanted to get a little more into the details. If you want to follow us along with us, we have linked from the show notes to this to a version translated by Elizabeth Carter. It's at antilogicalism.com. Do you have any opening thoughts before we just start reading, Wes?
It's good to get back to Epictetus, but I've always wanted to look at this. I thought we might come back to it on PEL, but I think we've done so many Stoicism episodes that we thought this might be redundant. But I remember when we were reading the handbook, what's the
Enchiridion is the
the Enchiridion, that I delved a little bit into this because in the secondary literature, it would say that something in the handbook was alluding to something that was more fleshed out in this book. So I think I delved in a little bit, but I had always wanted to go more.
Yeah, each chapter here is a saying, that might in the handbook just be by itself, but then it has several paragraphs to explain it. So we'll see how many chapters we want to actually get through here. You want to start us off, Wes?
Sure. Book 1, Chapter 1. Of the things which are in our power and not in our power. Sounds very familiar. Of all the faculties, you will find not one which is capable of contemplating itself, and consequently not capable either of approving or disapproving. How far does the grammatic art possess the contemplating power? As far as forming judgments about what is written and spoken. And how far music, as far as judging about melody? Does either of them then contemplate itself? By no means. But when you must write something to your friend, grammar will tell you what words you must write. But whether you should write or not, grammar will not tell you. And so it is with music as to musical sounds. But whether you should sing at the present time and play on the lute, or do neither, music will not tell you. What faculty then will tell you? That which contemplates both itself and all other things. And what is this faculty? The rational faculty. For this is the only faculty that we have received which examines itself, what it is, and what power it has, and what is the value of this gift, and examines all other faculties. For what else is there which tells us that golden things are beautiful? For they do not say so themselves. Evidently, it is the faculty which is capable of judging of appearances. What else judges of music, grammar, and other faculties, proves their uses, and points out the occasions for using them? Nothing else.
So that's interesting that being a second order judgment is the key thing that, so far he has not said anything about what is in our power and not in our power. This is just the introduction to that it clearly you'd think that a judgment about grammar would also be in our power, but I guess it is, I don't know. What do you think? Like whether we are going to make a judgment about grammar or just turn away and not pay attention to what somebody is writing or what we're writing, that's in our power, but the content, right? Whether a sentence looks grammatical or not is determined by the sentence itself, right? If we're doing it right. So it's not, whereas I think this looks like from our past knowledge of Stoicism, we have the things themselves, emotional situations are not going to tell us this is a tragedy. This is a great thing that's happening to you. Those are judgments that will end up being in our power. And so it ends up being apparently a second order faculty that's required to make this happen.
Okay. I'm not sure. So in the Enchiridion, let me just read the beginning of that, because this is we talked a lot about this on the obviously on the Enchiridion podcast. There are things which are within our power, and there are things which are beyond our power. Within our power, opinion, aim, desire, aversion, and in one word, whatever affairs are our own. Beyond our power, our body, property, reputation, office, and in one word, whatever are not properly our own affairs. So in our power versus not in our power was a way of designating a difference between mind and then externalities, I thought. So our misfortunes that might happen to us, whether other people like us, whether they admire us, whether they honor us, whether we become successful or not. So in this context, you have me trying to think this through now. I'm puzzled because you're applying, because he does say, he's talking about the power that the rational. Well, first he starts off, and this confused me at first, by saying there is no faculty which is capable of contemplating itself. And I thought, that's odd. What about rationality? And then, of course, he's going to say that exactly that. But what does he contrast to rationality? All these specific arts that are devoted to their objects. Maybe rational self-consciousness is a better way of terming the self-contemplative faculty, just given that rationality, of course, enters into all these different arts. So now explain to me how you're connecting this to the more general thesis of what's in our power and not in our power, because I haven't gotten there yet.
No, I'm just trying to take a guess at, even you can tell that these are somebody's notes. At least just the first sentence, it seems, is not quite complete. Of all the faculties, you'll find not one which is capable of contemplating itself, and consequently not capable either of approving or disapproving. But then the examples that he give are like judgments about music. Well, you could make a judgment that approves or disapproves of the music. So really, the end of this first sentence that's not included, not capable of approving or disapproving of itself, of its own judgments, something like that.
Well, the examples later on are there's the decision whether or not to sing versus the musical faculty constitutes knowledge about music, right? So you know a lot about music, and you know how to sing, you're a good singer, but the normative element is not governed by the art, the techne, whether or not to sing at any given time. That's an ethical, or it's not even an ethical question, but it's it's not unrelated. Broadly speaking, ethical. It could be an ethical question. It could be more, but it's a practical, broadly speaking. It's a practical question. So, and this is important. Well, we'll see why it's important. This whole idea of approving and disapproving is pretty central to Stoicism, and the idea that we can control, to some extent, control that, but that this is something within our power. But anyway, yeah.
Right. In the Enchiridion, he's straightforwardly, all of judgment is within our power.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't line up with the distinction he's making here, which is judgments about things like melody versus judgments about your own behavior. So
yeah, I think this is it's not inconsistent. It's just that we're getting a much more finer grained abstract discussion of this stuff, of what's just glossed over in the Enchiridion. To some extent, when we're making judgments about objects of knowledge, those judgments are governed by the objects of knowledge. But if we're making a judgment about what to do that's free from that, this is like heteronomy versus autonomy, right? It's not just, except that heteronomy involves desiring these externalities, but even in our descriptive judgments about the world, our scientific judgments, we don't have the freedom to say, oh, it's an inverse cube law, not an inverse square law. We're bound by that.
And I think even the ethical judgments, he's going to say, are right. If I am judging my own behavior and I have just given in and eaten a big piece of cake when I should already be full, then it is not really within my power to honestly say, that's fine. No, it was objectively the wrong thing to do, I think, according to the Stoic picture, because does not line up with what nature is going to, with my ultimate best interest.
And they have it's a virtue ethics, right? This is
Mhm.
in the tradition of Aristotelian virtue ethics. And so what is absolute, right? Nothing is good and bad outside of us in any absolute sense. It might be preferable or not preferable. My wife dies, no big deal. No, I'm just kidding. Not no big deal, but it's not good or bad in the strict sense. The only thing that's good or bad for the Stoic is being virtuous or not. And that is something, it is a inner spiritual state over which we have control. It's a state of mind, man.
Right. So this is what I'm trying to get at. If we want to at least try to line up this distinction here between first order faculties about objects and second order faculties reflecting on my own faculties, my own behavior, my own attitudes towards objects, is that it certainly the latter, again, I'm sort of running into, as I'm saying this, I was going to say the latter seem to be under our control, but if they're ethical judgments, they're really not under our control. They're determined by the things. So how do we splice that between it is not under my control whether to decide or whether to correctly decide, maybe this is the thing, whether this bit of behavior was good or bad behavior, but it is under my control to decide whether this happenstance constitutes a tragedy or not.
Well, this has been a recurring theme, and I think Leibniz I was going to say the one who put it best, but the account that I most enjoyed, of the difference between being bound by externalities and things we desire and between being bound by reasons. So when we're free, when we're autonomous, we are bound by reasons. Or Kant ultimately gives a very bespoke or boutique elaboration of what it means to be bound by our own reasons. We're bound by our own laws. Mm-hmm. But well before Kant, the way freedom of the will was thought of was that to be bound by reason was not the same thing as to be bound by desire, that there is an element of freedom in that. And the same thing for the recognition of external truths, right? So when a scientist has some insight into the world and discovers something new, they're bound by the nature of the world. But Kant himself, in the groundwork of Metaphysics of Morals, uses that as an example of the possibility of freedom, which is to say, yes, the world is the way it is, and our judgments have to line up with that if they're going to be true. But there's something that about that, which, because it transcends desire, because it transcends contingency, is freeing. So here it's a little bit confusing if we're trying to draw these larger implications from what he's saying here about the power of specific artistic judgments versus the general rational faculty. I think it would be odd to say, well, there's something unfree about the judgments that we make with respect to the external world. I'm not sure he's even saying that. So, but I think we should probably read on and try and figure this out.
Well, let me pull out this one more thread, because it is interesting that these examples that are giving of first order judgments are evaluative judgments of, presumably grammar is about what is good writing, not as like, did you conjugate the verb correctly? And certainly judgments about music, unless you think that music is a very strictly bound law-like thing. And I'm thinking actually of the contrast between the Confucian and the Taoist, that the Confucian is bound to call a spade, is bound to call, if this thing is bad, if this is bad music, if this writing is out of step with the best taste, then you are obliged to point that out. Whereas the Taoist is just like that, you have control over your own judgments, evaluative judgments of that sort. So just like judging whether my house falling down is a tragedy that I'm going to get upset about or not, that's clearly something that the Stoic wants to be feel free about. I would think that then whether this piece of music offends my ears or whether it is, whether I can adjust my judgment to take it in to see the bright side of it or something, in the same way that you'd see the bright side of, oh, my house has fallen down. I guess I don't have to pay property taxes, or, whatever your bright side of the alleged tragedy is.
Yeah, I want to emphasize a point that you just made, which I was kind of fudging in my account, which is that, yeah, he's talking about arts. So there's something normative here, because there's a good way to do things and there's a bad way to do things. I was using this word descriptive and I was thinking of the sciences, but this is a bit of a different case with techne.
All right, second paragraph. As then it was fit to be so, that which is best of all and supreme over all is the only thing which the gods have placed in our power, the right use of appearances, while all other things they have not placed in our power. Was it because they did not choose? I indeed think that if they had been able, they would have put these other things also in our power, but they certainly could not. For as we exist on the earth and are bound to such a body and to such companions, how is it possible for us not to be hindered as to these things by externals?
So the only thing which the gods have placed in their power, the right use of appearances. So the right use of appearances, this is a prevailing Stoic theme where there's the appearance of something through sensation, and we don't have any control over that, but we have a control over how we react to that. We have control over our evaluations of that, whether it's good or bad. So that's where the control comes in. Mark, you've been trying to assimilate this to what is it called? A higher order theory of freedom? Or second order? What is that theory called? Second order? Anyway. Yeah, and this sounds like that. You get this, the Stoics always move back to this meta level. There are these elements that are unfree, and then you move back to this meta level judgment about, say, the sensation that's been shoved into your mind that you can't do anything about. So for instance, you can see a beautiful person, can't do anything about that, can't do anything about the fact that they're hot, and can't really do anything about the fact that we naturally have those types of sexual desires, right? But you can, at a second order level, use them in a good or bad way. And right, so you can give into the lust, or you can say, wow, beauty, that is the good, and this is what I have to pursue. So, and then the other part of this is he's giving us an interesting hypothetical here, which is, what if the gods had given us not only the ability to be virtuous, be more practical in our decisions, and be like these ultimate cognitive therapy gurus, right? What if they allowed us to control the externalities themselves? So I'm not even subject to temptation because the beautiful person never walks by me in the first place, or I make it such that I don't know.
I mean, if
we were omnipotent, we could just say, all right, the sexual reproduction never happened. It's just we're all budding. We all. I don't know, but anyway, it's a weird hypothetical because it seems to make us godlike. But sorry, what did you just say?
I mean, there's a lot of things obviously we can change, right? We can put ourselves in a position where attractive people will not be walking by us. Just stay in your house, or avert your eyes. Something.
Blind people have it really good in that area.
But I like the sort of Leibnizian take. If it had been possible, right? It is our good to not be tempted, to not have bad things happen to it, because a calamity is a form of temptation. It's a temptation to despair. It's a temptation to get upset. So it would be best for us if those things did not happen. Well, gods want to make things good for us, right? we're all in the God's plan, right? Acting according to the Stoic way is to act according to the order of the universe, to act within nature. So this gets an idea, even though he hasn't said anything like this, and I don't recall this being stated exactly like this, that really this is the best possible world for us, rather than, well, this is just the way the world is, and you should fit in with us. Maybe that's the same thing. If it's the only possible world, by definition, it's the best possible world.
Yeah, but he's not saying it's the best possible world. He's saying the gods just couldn't do that. I mean,
Right.
maybe that amounts to the same thing in the end. They couldn't do that and have it be the best possible world, let's say. So they would have put these things in our power, so we would have been able to avoid all misfortune, and that would, and not be subject to the temptation of despairing, for instance, over, what was it, the house burning down or something.
Yeah.
But but they couldn't do that, according to him. If we're going to be on earth, if we're going to be physical incarnate beings, then all this other stuff just follows from that.
Right.
Interesting. All right, shall I read the next one?
Sure.
But what says Zeus? Quote, Epictetus, if it were possible, I would have made both your little body and your little property free and not exposed to hindrance. Okay, your little body and your little property, as in just a little bit of property, free and not exposed to hindrance. But now be not ignorant of this. This body is not yours, but it is clay finely tempered. And since I was not able to do for you what I have mentioned, I have given you a small portion of us, this faculty of pursuing an object and avoiding it, and the faculty of desire and aversion. In a word, the faculty of using the appearances of things. And if you will take care of this faculty and consider it your only possession, you will never be hindered, never meet with impediments. You will not lament, you will not blame, you will not flatter any person.
So it's interesting that it's not that a lot of these evils are because of free will. Free will is an overall good. I'm just thinking of the other versions of theodicy that we've looked at, that free will, it would be much worse for us to just be automatons. So we have free will, but of course people can misuse their free will. And so all sorts of terrible things are going to result from that, but that is still the best possible situation. You take the good with the bad. But here he's saying,
and of course, life.
Yeah, and of course, the response to that is always, well, don't a lot of bad things happen that have nothing to do with free will? That can't explain all the bad things. And so he's just saying, look, the fact of embodiment means that things that are bad, in fact, maybe it's not that the free will was the gift, but this body that is clay finely tempered, right? We could have given you a body made of steel, but that would be, it'd be really hard to lug around. So we gave you the optimal body, but it's going to fall apart. And it's embodied in a world with physical laws. And so, yes, things are going to catch on fire. Your body is going to die. Everybody around you is going to die. All those bad things are going to happen. And so as a recompense for that, we gave you this divine faculty that actually makes all the rest of that stuff not matter so much to you if you use this correctly.
You got my facts of life reference, right?
Oh, yeah.
Let's not explain it to the listeners so they can get it. Clay finely tempered. I love that metaphor. Yes, you're made of clay, not the greatest material, but we put you in the kiln. And now you have a mind. So, and with that mind, you can be saved if you just do the right thing. All right.
Had you actually finished the paragraph there? You will not lament, you will not blame, you will not flatter any person. Okay. Well, do these seem to you small matters? That's in quote. I hope not.
This is still Zeus talking, which somehow Epictetus feels
okay.
Inclined to, what does Zeus say? And then he's just telling us what Zeus says. Go ahead.
Well, do these seem to you small matters? And then not in quotes, I hope not. And then back in quotes, be content with them then and pray to the gods. Oh, so the these is the divine spark, the choice making facility. All right, we're now out of quotes. But now when it is in our power to look after one thing and to attach ourselves to it, we prefer to look after many things and to be bound to many things, to the body and to property, and to brother and to friend, and to child and to slave. Since then we are bound to many things, we are depressed by them and dragged down. For this reason, when the weather is not fit for sailing, we sit down and torment ourselves and continually look out to see what wind is blowing. It is north. What is that to us? When will the west wind blow? When it shall choose, my good man, or when it shall please Aeolus, for God has not made you the manager of the winds, but Aeolus. What then? We must make the best use that we can of the things which are in our power, and use the rest according to their nature. What is their nature then? As God may please.
Okay.
So I guess, right, we're distracted that it is okay to be attached to things, but only to the divine part of yourself. So it's actually not the case that it's a total philosophy of detachment, because you are very attached to your own faculty of free choice and therefore virtue.
Yeah, you're attached to your own virtue towards your own mental comportment to the world, and that's what you work on. So you're not working on getting rich, because ultimately that's up to fortune. You might be doing that as just a matter of living your life, and you happen to find a job which is lucrative or whatever. Or maybe you end up being like Seneca. What was he? As a bigwig in the government, right? So there lots of examples of Stoics doing very well for themselves. But that's not what you're pursuing. You're simply pursuing something about your own mind or your own virtue. You're refining your dispositions to behave and think and feel in certain ways. And that's the thing over which you have, it's the only thing over which you have control. And that's really fortunate, because it's the only thing that really matters.
The end of the paragraph is interestingly ambiguous. We must make the best use that we can of the things which are in our power. So that could mean there are limits to the free choice making facility, that even things within our power, well, we should do the best we can. I mean, that resonates with me, right? Your willpower seems to be within your power. It's right there in the name, your willpower. But yet there are lots of times when we fail that. So do the best you can with it. Or it could mean you have absolute control over your willpower, and you have the duty to do the best, to pursue the best course of action, given that you have that absolute control.
Yeah, the other ambiguity is that some external things are in our power, at least temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
So we can make practical decisions based on the circumstances, whether or not to walk down a certain dark alley. I don't know why that was the first thing that occurred to me. That's in my control at that moment. It may not be in my control to avoid getting mugged or murdered forever, but those specific things might be in my control at that point. I don't know. So in other words, there's an ambiguity between making the best use of the things which are in our power, which so far he said it seems like our own virtue and mental comportment to the world. But perhaps he also means here that in the short term, we can make these practical decisions that do involve earthly externalities, as long as we use them according to their nature. The reason why I'm bringing that up, because I'm thinking about the like the Stoic doctrine of what's preferable versus not preferable. It's not just complete withdrawal from the world. So we do have to navigate these things. It'd be one thing just to stop having sex altogether, right? But they're not doing that. They're still living within the world. They're still pursuing a career, pursuing love, all that stuff. And there are good and bad decisions to be made with respect to that. So anyway, I think we'll find out more as we go on.
But. Right. He hasn't actually said here what is in our power, that it's only our judgments that are in our power or not in our power. In fact, I don't know that these subsequent paragraphs have really clarified that first paragraph and its puzzle about second order judgments. Using the rest according to their nature. See, I would think that means that sometime, so in other words, the first half of the sentence, we must make the best use of the things which are in our power, interpreting that according to the manual, then that is only the internal stuff. The rest according to their nature, well, it might seem that, my car is within my power because I can go out and drive it around. But really it's not in my power, and I should use it according to its nature, which is that it is a machine, and machines break down and they have, a certain amount of control of it, but you really better be careful or you're going to run somebody over, right? There's just lots of things you have to be careful with the machine, even the machine that is your body, that I don't want to have a heart attack by eating too much crap or whatever the thing is. I don't want to slip and fall down the stairs. It's not very unlike the use of a car, the use of your body.
Yeah, we've discussed this fundamental ambiguity about what it means to live according to nature in our other Stoicism, our partially examined life Stoicism episodes. And that ambiguity, right, there's living according to nature as in my own human nature and what is virtuous, what my telos is. And then there's the acceptance of fate, the acceptance of the deterministic course of things, all the things that I can't control. And then there's the thing that I was just talking about. I'm introducing a third thing here. But the respecting the way things are in one's practical, I think, which is what you were just getting at, right, with the car example.
So another quote here that is not the God. Must I then alone have my head cut off? And then outside the quotes, what, would you have all men lose their heads that you may be consoled? Will you not stretch out your neck as Lateranus did at Rome when Nero ordered him to be beheaded? For when he had stretched out his neck and received a feeble blow, which made him draw it in for a moment, he stretched it out again. And a little before, when he was visited by Epictetus, Nero's freedman, who asked him about the cause of offense which he had given, he said, "If I choose to tell anything, I will tell your master."
I alone have my head cut off. So this sounds like a complaint about fatalism, maybe, but
poor me,
by this interlocutor, this imagined interlocutor. But why I alone have my head cut off? It says the interlocutor is imagining, well, everyone else is just going to live according to their own advantage and doing what's convenient and what's desirable. But why should I have to do something different? I'm going to be I might be alone in that, or at least among a very few people. And then I don't quite get the rest of this. We're just being given the example of an exemplary, virtuous person in the face of death. But
right. I had just been reading Death of Socrates, Platonic dialogues, and this just seems like exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
When you're faced with this thing, even if it is unjust, you can control whether you meet it with dignity. Stretch out your neck and make it easier for the headsman, because at least you could do that. It's not going to go any better for you if you're just going to get your face smashed. I don't really want to hear more about the gory details of being beheaded and how it can go wrong if they miss. But I guess
there's no stoic necessity, though, to not rebel against an unjust ruler or not try to escape an unjust punishment. This seems to imply that this was his obligation. And if so, we have to ask why. Maybe I think Epictetus is assuming this sort of obligation to an emperor. But shall I read on?
Yeah.
What then should a man have in readiness in such circumstances? What else then, quote, what is mine and what is not mine, and permitted to me and what is not permitted to me, unquote. I must die. Must I then die lamenting? I must be put in chains. Must I then also lament? I must go into exile. Does any man then hinder me from going with smiles and cheerfulness and contentment? Quote, tell me the secret which you possess, unquote. I will not, for this is in my power. Quote, but I will put you in chains, unquote. Man, what are you talking about? Me in chains? You may fetter my leg, but my will not even Zeus himself can overpower. Quote, I will throw you into prison, unquote. My poor body, you mean? My poor body, you mean? Quote, I will cut your head off.
I should just read the quotes so I can be the bastard. I will cut your head off.
When then have I told you that my head alone cannot be cut off? These are the things which philosophers should meditate on, which they should write daily, in which they should exercise themselves. Thrasea used to say, I would rather be killed today than banished tomorrow. What then did Rufus say to him? Quote, if you choose death as the heavier misfortune, how great is the folly of your choice? But if, as the lighter, who has given you the choice? Will you not study to be content with that which has been given to you? What then did Agrippinus say? Agrippinus? Agrippinus? Agrippinus?
Let's say
what did Agrippinus
Agrippinus. Let's say Agrippinus.
I think it's in the Latin. It's Agrippinus, but maybe it is Pinus. I don't know. He said, quote, I am not a hindrance to myself, unquote. When it was reported to him that his trial was going on in the Senate, he said, I hope it may turn out well, but it is the 5th hour of the day. This was the time when he used to exercise himself and then take the cold bath. Let us go and take our exercise. That was a quote. After he had taken his exercise, one comes and tells him, you have been condemned. To banishment, he replies, or to death? To banishment. What about my property? It is not taken from you. Let us go to Erycia then, he said, and dine. This is to have studied what a man ought to study, to have made desire, aversion, free from hindrance, and free from all that a man would avoid. I must die. If now I am ready to die, if after a short time I now dine because it is the dinner hour, after this I will then die. How? Like a man who gives up what belongs to another.
So inspiring, these examples.
You're
going to get killed later today. Well, do I still have a working credit card? Let's go out and have a nice dinner, and I can get killed later.
Well, why not just get on a boat?
Right. We
There's
don't
a
have
hidden premise here, which is
the Crito part of this, that like, yes, it's a terrible, Nero is bad, but you still have to obey him. It's the social contract. You've agreed to it by not fleeing earlier.
But it's important that, right, Stoicism doesn't tell me whether or not I should obey a corrupt emperor. I'm relying on these. I mean, maybe it does as a virtue ethics. I don't know, but it doesn't obviously do that. So, in other words, we're not going to. It's not that we would resign ourselves to everything. We might resist, but in this case, our lack of resistance is predicated on something apparently we owed to the emperor. But then the question is, when do we resist? We don't always just go with the flow. That can't be what the Stoic is saying. Oh, I slipped and broke my leg. I guess I'm just going to go with the flow. Why would I repair that? Why would I try to fix that? So there are questions here.
So that's an interesting question, whether virtue itself implies anything about the social contract. That it seems that from the Stoic point of view, it's only your own integrity that matters. And I'm not even really sure whether that should extend to promises made to other people, right? Because it seems like I mean, that seems the definition of integrity, according to most the way we've been thinking, and that's the way in the Crito Socrates puts it. I have made this implicit promise to obey the laws of the land by living here. I could have left at any point. I accepted its bounty as I was growing up, and then after I grew up, I had plenty of time to see what kind of society I was living in, and I decided to stay here. Therefore, I owe it my allegiance, even though they have made this particular decision that is unjust and against my interests. To go along with that, I should just stretch out my neck. And I'm not sure that should apply if, if there is a coup, or if there's if it's just regardless of the type of government. I mean, it was a democracy, even though Socrates doesn't say, well, I got to vote. I'm responsible. I'm part of this cooperative society. There's something that's representative about it in a way that is not here. And even beyond that, I'm asking you, Wes, what you think, whether promise making, it seems like that in a way could fall into external goods, right? What is is it okay to borrow money on the Stoic account when you know you will never be able to repay? Because it isn't within my power to get this money. And let's say I even have some virtuous things that I'm going to do with it. I'm not just going to spend it on a Xbox or whatever. But then is it just, it's external trappings, whether or not it shouldn't matter anymore. If I'm not going to be worried if somebody steals from me, why should I be worried that I have essentially stolen from somebody else?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you're making, because we're worried, if we're virtue ethicists, we're worried first and foremost about the implications for our own virtue. But again, we need this ethical apparatus, and it's not specific to Stoicism about what's right and wrong, or good and bad, or what's vicious and what's virtuous. And Stoicism, the details of Stoicism don't provide us with that ethical system. And as you're pointing out, maybe they in fact undermine it, because we assume that the suffering of the other person is what is important to whether or not an act is ethical. What distinguishes stealing from saying hi when you walk down the street or whatever, right? You're causing someone harm. And if nothing is really harmful except wounding someone's virtue, then what makes it unethical to harm others? Why don't they just stick out their neck and take it? So that's a really good point.
And apart from that, I mean, I led with, what about borrowing money that you're not going to return? Imagine that that's not actually going to be felt by it's a victimless crime, essentially. The person has plenty of money. It's not going to affect his life material in any way if I don't return this money. But yet, Socrates' last words in the Phaedo is like, hey, Crito, I borrowed some money from this guy. Could you just make sure that he gets paid back? It was really important to him to, even if others are vicious to you, it's because it's not actually about them. It's not about whether it's going to hurt them or not. It's about your own integrity. And so, yes, you have to have, I would think that hurting other people presumably would upset you. Although I guess if you're the Stoic sage, maybe you're past that.
Yeah, again, there are still preferable things that are preferable and not preferable. So we are just, by taking someone's life, we don't deprive them of an ultimate good. Or maybe let's use stealing as an example, since we're not depriving them of their virtue, but we are depriving them of a preference. We are still hurting them. Again, it comes down to this kind of fudging distinction that Stoics make between good and bad and preferable and not preferable. It's like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, right? But because we can't talk about our own integrity is not implicated unless we're wronging someone, unless we're doing bad something bad to someone. But if nothing bad can happen to you, when is it that we ever do anything bad to anyone, except by maybe corrupting them and saying, hey, have some wine?
Yeah.
And yeah,
it can't just be preferences, because that that doesn't distinguish between a legitimate preference and a vicious preference that, somebody would prefer that I suffer. I'm going to deny them that. Yeah, it's within my right to not suffer just because they would enjoy me suffering. But yet my taking their life or taking their property, that is a legitimate preference on their part. So
I think the domain of preferables
preferences
for Stoics implies legitimate preference. From what I remember.
Okay.
So we are talking about things that we ought to prefer. This is what complicates the account. Why ought we to prefer it if it's not good and on their account? But the other thing I wanted to say was Socrates in the Crito. His argument is that the laws of the state are among the formative influences that make him who he is. They're like parents. So the idea is that in a way he owes something to his parents, and what he owes to them is to reform them if they're bad. And he can't do that from outside. If he goes into exile, he can't help reform and make Athens great again, make Athens better. And that is somehow something he's fundamentally obligated to. And it's clear in the case of our own virtue, which is to say that if we have, it's not a corrupt government anymore, right? It's our own corrupt psyche. We have a lot of vices. The only way to reform that is from within. We can't just run away. And if we do run away, we abandon the polity or the psyche to its fate. And if in the political example, if we have to suffer the consequences for that, it's still for the greater good. That on principle, people don't just run away from a bad state, they try and fix it.
So what about being a soldier, right? You could see personal integrity as involving a principle of nonviolence, a principle of compassion, and saying, I don't care what you say that I have to do. I'm not going to hurt anybody. If you want to torture me, right? So Socrates gives the example in the Apology of, when I was commanded by the tyrants that had taken over, right? So this is not even a government he agreed to, right? He grew up in the democracy, and these tyrants took over to go basically lynch this guy, and I just went home. And that just shows that I, should not be in public life, because they command you to do all this stuff. So his version of integrity in that sense was not, I owe it to the state to do every little thing. I guess he owed it to the state to obey when they unjustly convicted him, to let himself be executed and to not escape. But it was not, I'm just wondering about these fine distinctions about action. Because he could have said, you go ahead and kill me. I'm not going to resist, but I'm not going to drink the hemlock. You're going to have to pour it down my throat, because I would be actually doing the unjust thing by drinking the hemlock. That seems like a legitimate.
Stoicism doesn't give us a lot of its own ethical guidance. You have to look elsewhere for that. So it doesn't tell us whether or not we should obey the state in some circumstance. It doesn't tell us whether or not we actually are obligated to someone in some way. And so it doesn't tell us when we should be going with the flow and when we shouldn't. If it's natural, we go with the flow. If it's necessary, if it involves obligation, or however you want to put it, then we go with the flow. But if someone is trying to force us to do something unvirtuous, I think we would have to resist. I think there are many cases in which we would simply have to resist. So it's fine to say go with the flow, but it doesn't give us any specifics about the circumstances in which we should do that, or the content of that.
Yeah, introducing natural in there, of course, is a very loaded term that you could, like Rousseau or someone, say, okay, there's certain things that are natural. My body dying eventually, that's completely natural. The fact that shit happens like that, but then these schemes of other people's or institutional issues, like in a way, it's still like you're caught like a fly in that particular web, and so you should just amor fati. You're a slave, go with it. But is that natural? Is that the way of the world? I mean, only on a very generous interpretation of what counts as natural is just uh, people's social status is natural. People are naturally social
Ideology.
animals.
This is what Marx would call ideology, right? It's natural. It's not a product of culture and the fucked up political order. It's just natural. Some people are in one class, some people are in another class. Nietzsche uses this example of eagles taking lambs. And it's just in the nature of some people to be predators and in the nature of some people to be prey.
Right. So sort of taking this back to your attitude towards suffering, if you really have an ethics that's focused on your own virtue, your own integrity, then the reason that you don't want to hurt somebody is the same reason you don't want to leave them owing money. Is because, or you don't want to not pay back your debts, is because that's the rule. And there would be something, right? If I were to, even as a soldier, right, I've received legitimate orders, maybe even it's in a just war. But if I were to then kill this enemy soldier, it would destroy something in me. It would break me. It would, it demonstrably does this to people, right?
Yeah.
And so it seems like your integrity should prevent you from doing that. But it just seems perverse to have an ethics that actually is, and I'm not sure that, again, maybe Stoicism is not actually committed to this, but that, because then it would be the same whether in fact you're in the matrix, whatever. In other words, are the people actually suffering or not? Right? If you were in some sort of Truman Show situation or whatever, where you've been put into the role of a soldier and you can choose whether to kill or not, it would still feel the same. You would still feel that sense of loss, even though there's no actual damage being done.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to figure out whether this actually makes a difference.
Well, you're giving a moral psychology there. So, in other words, even if it is the case that death is not objectively a bad thing, it could be our nature, our psychology, such that we will be damaged if we do that to people. And we don't want to damage ourselves, right? That's the mandate of virtue ethics. So I was trying to make the connection that, virtue ethics is kind of handicapped because to say what's virtuous and what's not virtuous, we have to look ultimately to this relationship with the other, to our comportment to others, and what's obligatory and what's not. And because, again, if it's Truman world and there aren't real people, and there are no ethical implications to killing, and maybe the Stoic is right that there are, that it's not bad in a sense, that losing one's life is not bad, and therefore is it bad to kill someone? So it could, in other words, there could be, it's possibly the case that there could be implications for one's own virtue, regardless of the absolute ethical status of some act.
Right.
It's a very jumbled thing there, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, look, we're talking like this because we've reached nearly the end of the hour and we don't want to start chapter 2. That's what it comes down.
No. I mean, I'm not trying to pad. I'm genuinely.
No, it is
actually
very legitimate stuff. I'm wondering whether there could be, and there probably are, versions of Stoicism that are legitimately interpersonal, not just that I have certain duties toward other people, but in the Buber/Levinas sense of where ethics comes from is a confrontation with the other, and they demand. It's not my self-legislation. It's their demand. You need to treat me as if I'm a world unto myself. And the fact that we have that feeling about ourselves makes that really hit home. Or maybe I'm reversing it, and it's the fact that people confront us that way, and then we eventually, hopefully, grow the self-esteem to feel that way about ourselves. But that ethics is primarily something that is not about our personal integrity. It is about the demands of a social world.
Right. Although it is true that if we don't owe anything to ourselves, we don't owe anything to others. Because if we owe something to ourselves, we owe it to ourselves insofar as we're human, right? And as you just pointed out, we know what suffering entails, and we have to know that personally in order to project that and imagine others suffering. So the people who are self-sacrificing to the point of, I'm my well-being doesn't matter because yours matters so much. Well, if your well-being doesn't matter, the other person's couldn't matter either, because it's either human beings matter or they don't.
Unless you have this version of my well-being matters, but my well-being is only to be defined by my own comportment toward myself, the Stoic virtues. So you can't hurt me. You can't lock me up. You can lock up my body, but you can't lock me up. And so the only thing that would be bad for me is to make a bad ethical choice. But making a bad ethical choice could then include all this stuff that actually respects others way more than I respect myself. I don't know if that's ultimately coherent. I think to be a good ethical person, you can't just, there's certainly something psychologically suspicious in, I treat you with respect because your eyes demanded of me, but then that doesn't actually make me respect myself at all. I just debase myself.
Yeah.
My material well-being.
People do this all the time, of course, right? They can be vicious with themselves in a way that they would never be with other people because they have a captive audience in a way, or they basically kidnap themselves. Other people, you get in trouble, you might feel guilty, you get some resistance if you treat them viciously. But it says a lot about it tells you a lot about yourself if you're willing to just savage yourself just because, you're, you hold this person completely in your power. There's nothing they can do about it.
Clearly, the Stoic would not want you to actually savage yourself, but in terms of being morally demanding with yourself, that's entirely the point. I know
I'm talking about guilt and self-attack, or
right,
bad conscience, right? Which doesn't necessarily give you good results. Yeah.
No, none of that stuff should be on the table for the Stoic. The Stoic is, but certainly if you have to make this strong division between what's in your power, well, my own will is within my power, at least to an extent. My past actions, well, they're not in my power anymore. So maybe I should be self-forgiving about that in the same way that I should be forgiving about other people. Actually, forgiving might be the wrong word, because that implies something more than just letting it go. Letting it go is what, right? You can't control what anybody else does. You just have to sort of make the best and work around them as if they were obstacles. And maybe that's even the same thing. It's got to be a different attitude, though, with your own past actions, right? If you don't just, you have to actively forgive yourself or hold yourself to account, make yourself accountable, because that's going to affect your future behavior in a way that it doesn't necessarily work that way.
I mean, the moral psychology of this is so complicated. Once you start examining it, and it becomes awfully confusing because we didn't have the chance to sit down and think about all this stuff before this conversation. Once you start delving deep with Stoicism, I think all these psychological questions are inevitably going to be generated, and they're just not easy to answer.
Well, I think we've for sure need to have a second episode on this text where we will read chapter 2. That was chapter 1, a little less than 2 pages long that we got through in this hour.